that defense attorneys argued was a false confession, but still, with all that was said and all the evidence against Christian Rivera, without a doubt, he was guilty.
No question, Derek. And you and I were surprised on Thursday when the jury hadn't returned a verdict. I agree with Ann on this one. The only surprising thing is that it took 7 hours of deliberation and we had to wait until Friday afternoon and finally get a verdict. I mean, Christian Rivera's story was beyond outrageous, probably one of the worst lies I've heard in my 20 years of practice as an attorney.
Also, 9 white jurors. The ages range from 19 to 71 years old. 5 females, 7 males, making up the jury of 12. The fact that there weren't enough Hispanics on the jury maybe could have played into this, do you think, Neama?
Well, I'm glad that we at least had 3 jurors of color. The initial reports were 1. I mean, this is a very tough case. You have an undocumented individual, very conservative state there in Iowa. You have the governor, making public statements about his immigration status, former President Trump. So very difficult jury pool for the defense. I think they did really what I thought was an admirable job under the circumstances up until their client testified. They had some really good legal arguments in terms of the confession, the botched Miranda warnings. They got a significant portion of it knocked out. They did a good job on cross-examination, notwithstanding this confession and the fact that their client led police to the precise spot in the cold field where Mollie Tibbetts was buried. So great job by the defense on a tough case. Again, up until their client testified. Then it went south right away.
And do you think that that's really the case, that it was the testimony of Christian Rivera that did him in?
Well, yeah, I agree. I mean, it was, I mean, most times you don't want your client to testify for obvious reasons, and jurors don't hold that against you or your client usually. But this one was so fantastic and unbelievable that in some ways it lessened the state's burden of proof. And when I was a prosecutor, when the defense got up and the defendant was going to testify, I often thought, shoo, I mean, my case just got a little bit better, and their case got a lot better when he testified.
To give a false confession based on these pre-existing conditions, could he be more likely to actually commit the murder, right, Neama Rahmani?
Yeah, I agree with Ann on this one. You really have to tread lightly if you're the defense. I mean, they obviously have to attack this confession, say it was coerced. I think the defense theory, at least with respect to Joseph, is going to be that mom, Crystal, murdered baby Joe using a pillow, and that's sort of the basis for that jail call. But once you open that door, judges give a lot of leeway during cross-examination. You could blow this wide open. And if you bring out all these mental health issues, a jury could easily find that this is the type of father who could beat his special needs son to death.
To maybe turn against the father, the husband in the case? I mean, she's going to be tried separately, so there's time there for her to decide one way or the other, right?
She will turn against him because we know that Joseph has already turned against his wife. There's no question in my mind that's going to be her defense in this case. But I have to agree with Ann. There's a special place in hell for a parent who would kill his or her own child, much less someone with special needs, nonverbal, autistic. These are the most vulnerable members of our society that we should all be protecting, but especially one's parents. So I expect the 2 parents to be pointing the fingers at one another, but it's going to be a weak defense at best. The jury is going to absolutely hate both of them.
Could it just be we had a blue light?
Well, Derek, the prosecution has to tell a story, right? And, there's certain things that the jury is going to want to fit those pieces of the puzzle together. One of the things they've been talking about is this phone call to the dean and the fact that it was Susan Berman that placed the phone call, not Kathleen herself, and that was the motive for Bob to kill her. And this blue light that has to potentially have something to do with either Robert Durst killing Kathleen or disposing of her body. There's something different, something sinister that the neighbors observed. And the rest of the testimony is important as well. I agree with Ann. The defense is painting this picture of Kathy Durst being a drug addict, a drunk, someone who's unstable, left multiple clerkships. And the state's saying, no, this is someone that would not just get up and leave, gone girl in 1982. This is someone that cared about her studies, was someone who was stable and was committed to finishing medical school. So foul play must have been the reason why she didn't do so.
Yeah, interesting. Also on the stand, we heard from Ruth Mayer's husband, Bill. Also, they were a couple together living in the home next door to the Durst. He testified under direct examination more about what he recalled around the time of Kathleen Durst's disappearance. Of course, from what they recall in terms of the discussion around this blue light, Ruth Mayer saying she remembers seeing it, calling it very odd. Neama Rahmani, I mean, this is something that the defense is going to have to really counteract, right?
They did, and I'm sure we're going to see some of the cross-examination when Dick DeGuerin went after um, Mayor pretty hard for speaking to the press and prosecutors, but not the defense. But really, the important part of his testimony, which you hit upon, Derek, was the alibi or lack thereof. You know, Bob Durst told prosecutors that he dropped his wife off at the train station and had drinks with some friends who were neighbors. And he gets up on the stand and he says, absolutely not. I did not see Robert Durst that night. So that was very important testimony for the state.
Yeah, a real hole in the story that Robert Durst has. He didn't actually see the blue light, but he very much remembers his wife pointing out the blue light and finding it odd, right?
Yeah, and sometimes as a prosecution, you got to kind of hit your point home and move on. You know, so much time was spent on this blue light and how strange it was. And I understand that the point that they're trying to make, but really kind of opens it up to cross-examination that really Bill here didn't see the light. He has no idea what the significance is, you know, aside from the fact that his wife reported the blue light. So again, you got to kind of move a little bit quickly. You know, I think you're going to lose the jury. I know they're committed to the next 5 months and over 100 witnesses, but if I were the state,
No.
I would move through some of these witnesses a little bit faster.
Yeah, and we really got to get to the heart of this, right? How the disappearance of Durst's wife, first wife Kathleen, really connects to the death, the murder of Susan Berman. I mean, that's what this trial is really about, and that's what the defense has and the prosecution, for that matter, have got to get to in terms of the heart of it. Neama, we're talking about facts and circumstances dating back some 40 years ago. I'm amazed at the recollection of the witnesses here. Is that difficult in terms of for the defense trying to find a way, you know, to get around the time that has passed?
Derek, yeah, it's challenging for both the state and the defense. I mean, you have both attorneys, witnesses, they're talking about a phone call that was made in 1982 and the significance of this phone call. The state arguing that there's no way Kathy Durst would call out unless she was gravely ill, and she certainly wouldn't call out on the first day of her clerkship. And if she were to call, she would call her immediate supervisor, not a dean of the medical school. And lastly, if she were to call the dean, she wouldn't complain about personal female issues such as headaches and cramps. So all of this is part of the state's theory that it was actually Susan Berman who placed this phone call, and the fact that such a strange phone call was made is inconsistent with Kathy Durst making it. It's fascinating to see this videotape testimony. Michael's talking about depositions, and you rarely see these in criminal cases, but the prosecution has done a good job locking in these witnesses using a rarely used provision of the California Penal Code that allows for this type of testimony when a witness is older and may not make it. So credit to John Lewin and his team. I think Dick DeGuerin did a really good job hammering home this change in testimony by Dean Cooperman. And even though he's one of the best in the business, I have to disagree with him on one point. I think he asked one question too many that really allowed Cooperman to really explain away why he changed his story. Had he just stopped, I think he made his point. He had hammered it home that really for decades, Cooperman had no reason to question that it was Kathy Durst who made that phone call. Only after speaking with local law enforcement here in Los Angeles and prosecutors did he at least open the possibility to Susan Berman or another female making that phone call. Don't look at Bob Durst now, who is frail in his late 70s with bladder cancer there in the courtroom. The prosecution wants the jurors to know that he was a violent person, not just violent towards his wife, but violent towards others. I mean, this was really an assault on a completely innocent person. Really, the only reason that he was assaulted was because he was alone in the room with Kathy Durst, and that infuriated Bob. So the state wants these jurors to know that this is someone who has a propensity to violence, and he's someone who could be a murderer. He has murdered before, and he'll do it again if necessary. Yeah, Michael, there's some additional testimony that he actually kicked Peter in the head. I think that part wasn't played. So the state
I still think propensity. The danger, Neama, on this is that a jury will end up convicting Durst because he kicked someone in the head, not because he shot someone in the head. You know, this type of evidence is never to be admitted to show propensity. That's why it's not allowed to come in. So from a defense perspective, I don't get it, but
could play into at least the jurors' minds this testimony from Peter Schwartz on what they think happened here.
Look, I completely understand Michael's position. Criminal defense attorneys hate this prior bad acts evidence, the 404B evidence, but we as prosecutors, we love it. And especially in a case like this, it's a difficult case for the state. You really don't have a whole lot of direct evidence, right? You have Durst's admissions in the jinx, at the end of the jinx, and then you have this cadaver note. But really, other than that, there's no physical evidence. There's nothing. It's a purely circumstantial case. So what the DA is trying to do here, John Lewin, is dirty up Robert Durst, make sure the jury doesn't like him. So they're going to bring in as much evidence as they possibly can. I mean, you have this episode, but you have Lewin talking about Durst using food stamps and shoplifting during his opening statement. So, and this Judge Wyndham, has pretty much allowed everything in. We're not just talking about Susan Berman's murder. We're going all the way back to Kathy Durst, a murder that was never charged. We're talking about Morris Black, a murder that was charged and for which Durst was acquitted. So different judges are different, but this particular judge is allowing almost everything in, much to the pleasure of the prosecution here.
Neama Rahmani, it was brought up that maybe different statements were made to police versus what was made to movie producers, and there was a discrepancy there, right?
Derek, this is Hollywood, What better way to handle a Hollywood case than to show these jurors? Apparently, they're going to see all or parts of all good things, and same thing, apparently they're going to see all of the jinx, which is just surprising even to me being out here in Los Angeles. But I thought the defense scored some good points in cross-examination here, really showing some inconsistent statements Schwartz had made and really showing that he was deciding whom to speak to and what evidence to provide based on who was willing to pay him. Not the best look for the prosecution here with one of their at least key prior bad acts witnesses. If I were the state, I would have really tried to get some of these bad facts out on direct. You don't want your witnesses to get beat up on cross-examination like this. Peter might not have felt that way, but it kind of made him look a little bit sleazy, in my opinion, in the eyes of the jurors.
This witness talking about him being kicked in the head and talking to movie producers seems to really distract from the real issue here.
Derek, we spent more than 2 weeks talking about Kathy Durst, right? Very little evidence about Susan Berman so far, a few law enforcement officers. But most of these witnesses are medical school classmates, faculty from the 1980s, neighbors, So I know for decades people have wondered what happened to Kathleen Durst and her not getting the justice that she deserved and the New York DA not prosecuting this case like she should have. But apparently it's all happening here in Los Angeles. So I understand why the state is doing it, because this is really the only way they can show motive for Susan Berman's disappearance, right? I mean, we're going back through this old testimony, old evidence. And as Michael said, this is a lesson in evidence, how to lay the foundation for those business records. Normally these don't come in, but this witness doesn't have much of an independent recollection as to what happened almost 40 years ago. So I expect more of the same in the coming days and weeks.
Right. And